Hello, everyone, and welcome to the School of Traditional Arts. We're very excited to welcome two calligraphers here tonight, and I just wanted to quickly tell you the school is here in London. We're talking to you from our third floor in London. The purpose of the school is really to encourage the traditional arts in the contemporary world as continuing traditions. And we're very interested in looking at historical art forms to help us to inform our work as artists today and to open out creative pathways for ourselves as artists today. My name is Emily Pott, and I work with the research students here, people doing MPhils and PhDs. We also have a taught MA program, and we have outreach programs all around the world. And you're here as a part of our open program, which is for the public. And this particular lecture is part of our open program Year of the Book. So I'm here with Avielah Barclay. Avielah is a calligrapher. She is she's a sopheret, which is a title given to a Hebrew ritual scribe. And she is the first female sopheret in modern times. She'll perhaps say a little bit more about this as we speak today. So she writes Torah scrolls, and she is teaching a class here at the school on the 2nd of February. So you have 2 days to register for that class if you're interested in that. And then to her right is Joumana Medlej, who is interested in Kufic calligraphy. She researches and teaches traditional Kufic calligraphy, which is really the first Arabic style of calligraphy that happened just after Islam was founded, really, in the very early times of Islam. And in many ways, it has been forgotten, and she's trying to bring that back to our attention today. She also uses Kufic calligraphy in her own contemporary approach to contemporary arts practice. So I think that if I didn't even have any questions to ask, the two of them would be able to talk for a very long time because they have a lot in common, and they're actually friends and they've worked together on various projects, and I think they share knowledge. But I'm just going to start by asking a couple of questions, and then we'll see where we go. There'll also be time at the very end of our session for people to ask questions in the last 15 minutes. If you want to ask a question, if you could put it into the chat, then the questions will be fed to us and we'll answer those questions for you. So I think the first thing that I really wanted you both to talk about is kind of to help us to understand how you first got interested in these old traditions and in them today as contemporary artists, and sort of how you went about trying to find teachers or to learn about them, just how you got started, really. And I don't know, yes, you decide who wants to start.
You want me to start? I don't want to. Okay. Well, in my case, learning Hebrew calligraphy and ultimately becoming a sopheret, becoming a scribe, where you make Jewish ritual objects. Really, what it comes down to is I watched Fiddler on the Roof way too many times when I was a child. It's the first time I ever remember seeing the Hebrew letters, and they looked like black fire on white fire to me. And I didn't realize it at the time because I was a very little child, that there is actually a midrash, a legend about the letters of, well, the Hebrew letters, but certainly the letters of the Torah being black fire on white fire. And so it's very much bound up in the mystical tradition as well. So, I mean, that's partly what inspired me. It's a very long story, but short is basically eventually I was able to find 2 teachers in Jerusalem who were willing to teach a woman, because that was not being done any longer. I was very fortunate to have the teachers that I had and have, because I actually, it's a very long mentoring process as well. And you have to be shown, you have to be told, you have to watch, you have to be watched. It's also, there's a rule book like this, but yeah, it's really a labor of love, and it's also service. It's in Hebrew we say it's avodat shebalev. It's the service of your heart. So that is something that you have to bring to the work. Whoever you're doing it for, it's service. So.
And it's interesting, this idea that you have to watch, that someone can tell you how to do something, but it's actually sitting next to someone where you're watching them, you know, the movements that they're making to create these letters, and then is there an aspect of that instead of just reading about it or being told about it?
Well, yes, I mean, you can read about it all you want. You can read the rule book, you know, and but that is not going to make you will miss things if you don't have someone who is wiser than you and more experienced than you, also drawing your attention to other things, or looking at your letter forms, or watching how you cut your quill, or just all of the many things that you need to learn how to do. If they don't see you do it, then there's going to be something missing in your practice that you're not going to know about. So yeah, it is literally like standing at someone's elbow and watching and asking, and also being quiet and, and listening, and sometimes not asking a question, but just like receiving. So yeah, so
some is happening in words, but also there's a lot that's not happening in words.
Very physical.
Joumana, maybe you can tell us more. This is a little bit of a different story.
Yes, to begin with, I wasn't particularly interested. I wasn't looking for anything. I had a very different kind of work. But there's this wonderful artist in Lebanon who is very respected, called Tamir Sayer, who asked me to come and be his assistant and help him with his work in his studio. And I said yes, just because I respected him so much. But I was for 5 years in his studio working on word-based art, but he's not a traditional calligrapher. So he's always reinventing the script every time. And we worked a lot with Kufi, forms of Kufi, because it's such a constructed style. So it allowed him to create shapes, etc. And there was no formal teaching at all. I'd just come and say, this is what we're doing today. And then we would work all morning in silence. Then we'd have tea and he would tell me stories. You know, that was the format for 5 years. But so looking back, it was like a traditional apprenticeship when you're not told what to do. You just do it, and then it's very embodied, and you learn it through the body. So by the end of it, it was second nature to me, and I was really into it, and I was starting to have ideas of my own. So after that, when I moved here for various reasons, and I took the opportunity because I had British Library at my doorstep all of a sudden, and research was much easier. I took the opportunity because I wanted to know more about Kufi, you know, the historical origins, the style, etc. So I started really researching it in depth. And from researching it, I started recreating it because, again, we were not working with anything traditional in his studio. But I had acquired a really good sense of it, but from the end, from the contemporary aspect. And I was going back to the source through research. And then this led me to also research materials, also going back to the source. So I've been learning. After I learned so much from him that was very intangible in terms of attitude, in terms of how to be with the work, in terms of not thinking about it, just doing it. And now I'm learning directly from the letters, if you like. I like to say the letters are my teachers, because from the primary sources, again, I am learning the rules again. I can find the rules from there.
So when you say you're learning from the letters, first of all, can I quickly ask you before I go on to that question, was there something you were drawn to Kufic? Can you explain for those who don't know, you know, the difference between Kufic and later styles? Perhaps?
Yes. So Kufic is basically the early tradition of Arabic calligraphy. So we had, after the revelation of the Quran, there were about 6 decades where it was just handwritten. We call this period the Hijazi styles, which are not calligraphic styles because every scribe had their own handwriting. And then very suddenly, around the year 700, Kufi appears. And it first appears in the Dome of the Rock in a mosaic. And then the styles, all these different styles we call them Kufi. It's a really bad name, but we're stuck with it. All these different styles based on that, so some of them architectural and some of them in pen and ink, are derived, and they really keep the style from that mosaic. It's not at all a cursive style. And it was purely a Quranic script, or a series of them, but every one of them is slightly different. So it's not at all a strict form. But I'm not going to go too much into that. But in parallel, at the same time, the round scripts were developing for scribal use, so much faster to use, much more cursive, the kind of thing you use for bureaucracy and for daily things, not the slow hieratic style. But eventually, within 3 centuries, they started developing rules to make them more calligraphic, and eventually they took over. So the early tradition disappeared completely. It completely ended, and what we have now is the later tradition. For me, it's still modern, even though it's started in 10th century. Still this new thing, But yes, but there is a big difference. So when people who have studied Nasakh or Thulus come to Kufi, they're surprised because the letters are not the same.
Yeah.
A lot of things are so different, they have to forget everything and start from scratch.
And when you say you're taught by the letters, I know a lot of my students, I work with research students in lots of different types of working from different traditions, different media, but almost always I think they can learn loads by looking at an historical piece of work. So even if they can't find someone to teach them how to do something, they can set up a relationship with this historical
Absolutely.
piece of work. So is that sort of what you mean by letting the letters teach?
Yes, that's absolutely. I mean, I don't have a choice because there are no living teachers.
Yes.
If other people, there are very few people who work with Kufi, and they all do the same as me. They kind of reconstruct it from, there's no lineage. So I get everything from, you can learn everything from looking at historical source. If you take the time, if you sit and if you really look and look and look again. But everything you need to know is contained in there. So yeah, absolutely. That is a very good method if you don't have a teacher. And the idea that you need to find somebody to teach you, I mean, if you can, that's fantastic. But if you can't, it's there. The material is there.
And I think that you sort of said something a little bit the same, that you had to sort of slow down. You had to be, when you were being taught, one of the things you learned was to slow down. Now, does that have something a little bit to do with this idea of looking at things in a slightly different way than you might have done when you first walked in? And
yes, it does, absolutely. Part of it is that your eye needs to be trained. You have to look at not just the letter forms, but you have to look at the spacing within the letter, in between the letters, and between the words, an entire document or an entire page of a scroll, for example. And there are different ways of assessing that. But you also have to be with the learning in that if you're anything like me and your brain goes a million miles a minute. And for example, when I was at the elbow of my teacher, he would ask me to read to him in the Hebrew, the original text, and say, all right, tell me what this says. And so I would be translating it to him, and then I would stop and say, wait a second, because there was something it had just said that I know today is not the case. And he would just be like, keep reading. Just actually what he said was shut up and keep reading. Because sometimes if you find the right teacher, sometimes they need to tell you to just zip it and continue being present with whatever it is that you are learning. And if you know something else, or if you have a different experience, just put it here and just receive what it is giving you, and then have the conversation afterwards. Don't let any of these barriers happen. So, yeah.
And I mean, I suppose there's all of that aspect. There's learning about all those letter forms and learning how to approach them in the way that they can teach you, in a sense. And then there's a whole nother side to things, which is all the sort of materials that you're using. And, is there a moment where the teacher is teaching you that, or how have you found that all about? Have you had to do your own research to understand more about that? How does that come about, knowledge of the materials?
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of knowledge from the materials, at least in my experience, has been using them, because by using them and paying attention, then you understand how they react, and you start to learn what their limitations are, and you understand what they are best for and what combinations. So for example, originally I was told, well, you should buy this ink and you should, buy this and buy that, But for me, because there are supplies, it's the art. Making Judaic and doing Hebrew calligraphy is one thing. And of course, there are rules because it's calligraphy. But actually doing like ritual Hebrew calligraphy, like for example, Torah scrolls, there's very specific materials you have to use. And about 4,000 rules. And so you can buy these things in shops and people make it for you. It's not always easy if you're a woman, but it's been getting easier. But I have always been curious about that. So I started delving into it because I wanted to get that intimate with the materials. Because if you don't know your tools, then you're missing something. You're not having a complete relationship with the tools, with the result, with the process, with your practice. And that is one of the things actually that we found in common, and something that actually really inspired me with all the work that you do, as far as all of the like collection of different soils from different parts of the world, and and all.
Dragging you through the mud to find
It's heaven, honestly.
Very muddy.
It was very muddy, but it was, for the best reason. Like, who cares about mud when you're actually like collecting, ingredients where you're going to make your own ink and you're going to create something. So yeah, it's inspiring and it's fun and it's a lot of hard work, and you have to subvert yourself to receive what's there. Otherwise you won't be in full relationship with it, and you won't be able to create work that is fully embodying like the best of all of the materials, as well as your own practice, not yourself, but your own practice.
So there's a sense of separation that you're trying to get beyond in a way by doing these processes yourself. So when you go to buy them from the shop, there's a bit of a separation there, and you're trying to get beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an intimacy. It's partly that. I mean, for example, cutting your own reed or cutting your own quill is part of the training.
You start with that. You kind of start with
that's one of the things that you start with. Yeah. I mean, it'll be maybe a little bit different depending on the teacher. But no one says, oh, you have to make your own ink, otherwise you can't be a true sofer, soferet, a true Hebrew scribe. Nobody worries about that. And there are a few different recipes. There's a few different kinds. All of the recipes that we use today are based in the earliest writings we have in the Talmud and places like that. And it's very similar to, and this is conversations that we've had where we're like, really? It's in your ink too? Oh, yes, we also have this in our ink. Oh, it's the same. Yay. But when you look at the fact that writing came from one place,
yes.
I mean, in alphabets, I'm talking about, and abjads, right? Because Hebrew and Arabic are abjads. They're not alphabets strictly, because they have consonants and then vowel markings.
Yes.
That came later. The other intimacy is also like looking at the different kinds of Hebrew scripts and how those letters evolved, because the way they look today, they didn't always look like that. And there are different ways of writing them, and there's cursive, and depending on where in the Jewish world, some Hebrew can look quite Gothic. If it was written in Germany hundreds of years ago. Some Hebrew looks very much like Arabic if it is from the Maghreb, if it's from North Africa. It really depends. So, I mean, there's even Judeo-Arabic. There's actually the language that exists. So there's a lot of intertwining that has happened. And it's something that I think deserves to be preserved and treasured and passed on, really. In the UK, the practice that I have, the Hebrew scribal arts of Sofra, is considered an endangered practice. It's on the website of endangered traditional arts.
Right.
So it's important for people to get to grips with it and to practice it very faithfully, and also to have students. That's important as well.
Yes.
And then when your student bests you, then you know that you're a good teacher, because really what you want is your students to be better than you are.
As well.
Yeah.
And you've had to do a lot of research. You found that a lot of misinformation was coming
Yeah,
down about materials.
So what happened with me is like many people, when I started making art, I wasn't thinking of materials at all. And then actually it's a course here at the school that really opened my eyes to handmaking and materials. And it became increasingly a big part of my practice. But I realized I could not find any information about art materials in the medieval Islamic world. There's nothing about it. You can find some very erudite papers about it, but there's no information. So I've had to, again, go back to the sources. And we have surviving manuscripts, texts from that period. We have Zinat al-Kataba, we have Umdat al-Kuttab, so there's a list of them. And digitized manuscripts are available, but they have not been translated. Some of them have been transcribed into Arabic by people who didn't even understand what they were looking at. So that even Arabic speakers massacred the text,
Right.
copying from Arabic to Arabic, which I will stay polite. And there's one text very famously, the only text that's been translated into English and that all codicologists use because it's the only one accessible to them. It's been so horribly translated because it's armchair translation by somebody who had no idea of the practice, had not tried anything, did not understand you cannot, these are technical treatises. So if you're not a practitioner, you should not touch them because you have no idea what they're talking about. And it ends up being like a magic text with all gobbledygook. You read the translation, you're like, whoa, is this for real? And actually the real text is really down to earth and simple.
Interesting.
Down to don't shake the jar like so many idiots do. So I've had to go back, read from the manuscripts and start translating them to, with my experience. And for me, using the original materials, I mean, it's not so much necessarily the original materials. I'm not trying to be as authentic as possible, but in my contemporary practice as well, making the materials is very important because something I do in both is, this is a transformative practice. Kufi was definitely a kind of spiritual practice. It's meant to transform the practitioner, and it does automatically, even if you're not trying, by its own nature. And therefore, to begin by transforming materials, raw materials, into art materials is very appropriate. And now I cannot imagine the process without that. I cannot imagine just getting something off the shelf and working with it because it has not gone through the transformation. It's not in harmony with everything else.
I mean, it's interesting because you're both, you're speaking a lot about transformation that has to happen for you, in a sense, to be able to do this. But it also seems like it's something that it's almost like, it's not like a deliberate, I need to transform to be able to do this. It's almost like something that happens without your even knowing, in a sense, like that it's a sort of transformation that comes through the practice itself in a way.
Very simple, very basic rule. The ego cannot transform the ego. Yes. You have to give it up. And one thing I found about Kufi is, for instance, two things. One is, if you don't have inner stillness and patience and silence, it will impose them on you because you have to have that inner quietude and that patience and that perseverance. It's a slow style. And second, what was the second point? It was important, but now, of course, it's flown from my head. Oh yes, it is very counterintuitive. So if you constantly have to hold back your hand because it doesn't follow the natural movements of the hand. It is very carefully constructed. So you cannot let go of your attention for a second. You always have to be there, make sure the hand does not do what it wants to do. So there's a lot of self-discipline. So you're taming the beast continuously until, the beast is no longer pulling at the rein. And therefore, something has been transformed, but you cannot do it to yourself. You just have to accept the discipline, accept that there is no shortcut. And then it's very interesting what happens. Because people who are in a hurry, if you want shortcuts, you just want to get it done, all you can do is imitate. So you reproduce forms. if you go through the process, you do it properly, you accept that it's not about you and it's not about how amazing you are as an artist, it's about the tradition and it's about doing it authentically, then a different kind of creativity creeps in and you're not even aware of it. And that's the exciting part. And I think you always also experience that.
Yes, everything she just said. Yes.
Yeah, it's something that I know that my students talk about too, this idea that there's never a force, you can never, it's not a forcing that happens. And when you think about it, it stops happening, you know, and it's only something that you're aware of when you look back on it in a sense, and then you think to yourself, something has happened there, and now I'm here where I am now, and I'm different than I was then. But it's almost comes to you much later that's when that thing happens. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think part of it, I mean, as far as the tradition that I'm a knowledge keeper for, sorry, that's your expression, I'm still in it.
Oh yes, I'm giving you that expression.
Not a gatekeeper, a knowledge keeper.
Yes.
Anyway, that's her, it's not me. Yeah.
Well, it's an Indigenous First Nations expression, I think.
Oh,
I
yes,
think I got
that's
it
true.
from Robin Wolfmer.
Oh, really?
But I think it applies to all traditions.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Good. So there's an idea in Judaism that, I mean, just as it says in the beginning, in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit, as we call it, it says that basically the world came into existence every time God spoke it into existence, and that the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are literally the building blocks of creation, and they each have a job. So when you come to write, that is the kind, you have to keep that in mind. That's not one of the rules, you don't have to keep that in mind, but it is something to be aware of, that this tradition goes back longer than we really know. And the fact that you are going to be in relationship with these letters and these words, and you're going to be giving them life through your own embodied practice, otherwise they wouldn't exist. They do exist separately from you, is really important. There's a part of the Talmud in Eruvin 13a, I think, where Rabbi Meir, who's one of the famous rabbis in the Talmud, who is a scribe, he says, he meets a young man and he says, "My son, what is your profession?" And he said, "I am a scribe." And he said, "Oh, you must be very careful," I'm paraphrasing here, "because if you add one letter or omit one letter, you could destroy the whole universe." Because it's this idea that everything has its place and you can't add or subtract from it because everything is just perfect the way it is. And that is where you have to contract yourself and, like forget your ego, and you need to, it's all on you to have that relationship with those letters.
Yes.
And then you have to let them take you down that path.
Basically, you have to get out of the way and let them come through you.
Thank you. Eloquent.
In iconography, it's always about emptying the self so that something else can fill the vessel. So.
I think all traditional arts have that same element where it's not about you, you are a conduct for a great tradition.
A vessel, exactly, a conduit,
So I guess I also wanted to ask you a little bit, because we're talking about, these forms, these letter forms. And I always think that people think of traditional arts like calligraphy as sort of quite constrictive in a sense, like you're saying, that you learn these letter forms, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about creativity and about the calligraphy as a pathway for creativity, and what you thought about that, how, if you experienced that in your work in some ways, and how it differs to maybe things that you were doing prior to as an artist.
Kufi is quite particular because if you look at the work of, even different scribes who work in the same style, you will always find the individuality. And I think it comes down to the fact that it's not standardized and that it has such a long, because it's transformative, instead of learning how to do a letter in a certain way, in a certain form, you are changed, you really embody it. And then whatever you do, you will still be working within the rules.
Yes, yes.
Because it's become such a part of you. You know, that's why it's such an interesting thing. And from there, you know, and that's why I say Kufi, every time you look at it, it's reinvented. It's constantly reinvented, because that's the only way you can do it. You cannot give somebody a sheet and say, this is how you do it. You have to explain, they have to, I find it quite challenging to teach it actually, because I cannot give it as a very strict, it's very simple to have a 1, 2, 3, you're done, but learn it in a way that allows this creativity to come through is quite challenging with the time we have generally. But definitely, because what I find in my contemporary work is, because it's so much a part of me, it's a visual language for me, and I can use it any way I like, but I always know where to stop, because I know the point beyond which I have lost it. So I don't go there, but I also know everything I can do within that. And actually, I find, instead of thinking about this as the limitation of tradition, I think about it as the container of tradition, where it defines a space, and then I don't have to worry about 10 million possible choices of shape and color and size. I can, okay, this is the area I'm working in, then now I can focus on what's important, and which is the visual expression. So it's actually it's very liberating to have this container, as opposed to be like, do whatever you like, because when you do whatever you like, you're free floating, you're not rooted in anything. Whereas if you're rooted in a tradition, it holds you in a certain way, and the work is held in a certain way, and it really makes a difference. You know, and this is the difference between somebody who's learned a tradition and who's doing something creative, and somebody who hasn't learned a tradition and is doing whatever. You can see the difference. There is a depth that is lacking. There is a sense of being part of something greater that is lacking. So yeah,
it's having that experience and knowledge together, and having it integrate into yourself through practice, through understanding, and through following rules, until it really, as much as it seems like it's closed and very strict, at the end of the day, when you go through that narrow place, it opens up for you again in a completely different way. And the only way you can experience that is if you go through that narrow place and you persevere. And in Jewish tradition, we talk about like dvekut, where you cleave with something. Usually it's meaning you cleave with God, but yeah, it's about cleaving, becoming one with something. And I think in contemporary writing, I think a more recent word would be like when Robert Heinlein used the word grok, to grok something is not just to know a fact, right? And not be able to just repeat something off, but it's something, it's information and it's experience and it's things that you like understand in the most deep way, that it's a part of you.
A different type of thinking, in a sense, or a different type of knowledge than the sort of information.
It's knowing, it's feeling as a way of knowing. It's not just you know, you read something and then exactly.
Well, you brought some things to show us.
Show and tell.
Show and tell. So, and we were talking a little bit before we started about just these, and these are
the gallnuts.
Yes,
These are well, the gallnuts are they are a parasitic growth on oak trees actually, and these come from the Middle East, so you can see they're knobbly. I don't know if you can see actually because we're far away, but these are basically they wrote the history of calligraphy very literally, because that's what the ink is made from. So these are ground and then boiled, and then some ferrous sulfate, which is vitriol, is added, and this magically produces the black ink that we both use.
Yes.
We both brought a bit our main tools of the trade, and they're exactly the same. A duplicate set.
Yep.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of connections here, you know.
Oh yeah,
like the two.
absolutely. Yes. It was fun discovering that in the beginning, wasn't it? It's like, oh, you use that, so do I. What do you call it? It's the same word, you know. And it's funny. I mean, through my research, and I think you found this as well. When you look at the Arabic and Hebrew words for the tools, they're basically the same for almost all of them. But they also, it turns out, they come some of them are a bit Greek influenced, but they ultimately come from Egyptian. Because
Right, interesting.
they had carbon ink, right, that they would write on papyrus, and it just spread across, you know, a lot of the rest of the world after that. But then, yes, this is slightly different ink. I have my own version here. This particular recipe is by a Yemenite rabbi who's a scribe, and I quite like it because it is very glossy and very black and very shiny. I mean, it looks wet all the time. Not everyone would like this. In fact, it's interesting. I was talking to someone recently and they said, oh yeah, I was reading a Torah at the synagogue, and I think it was written in this because of the way we have the lights in the synagogue, and I was trying to read it because it was such shiny ink. It was really hard for me to read. And I thought, oh no. But it's not great if you're going to be doing repairs, because you want to have an ink that is going to be a little bit more matte, you know. So like there's other kinds of ink that are not quite so shiny and don't stand up like enamel on the paper. But it is a very beautiful look, and it's super flexible as well for all the rolling that you have to do, you know, because it has a lot of gum Arabic in it. You know, it's got a very high you know, concentration of that. So so there's that, and then there's a little cube I made of which, well, I didn't actually pick this up. I didn't know whether anyone was able to see that, but this is, if I can open it.
It's very precious.
Well, I just didn't want it to break. It's very
Beautiful.
I think you have
know,
to hold the
let's
cube
see
up
if
to the
It's almost like a tesseract. From
it's
the movie.
yes, well, and you know, and so when I make my own ink, I didn't make this obviously. When I make my own ink, I have this little it's like a
silicone mold.
thank you. Yes, those words. And I put the mixture in there and let it dry. And then all you have to do, and traditionally this is what both Hebrew and Arabic scribes and everyone in the Middle East, they had dry ink, and then as needed, they would wet it. There's different methods of that. So I would do that. And you know, and I also make it, if people want it, I also like make it and sell it to them. But yeah, so I like to work in 1 centimeter cubes, because that's how I roll basically.
Or not.
So you read pens, yeah?
Well,
Am I right about that or not?
well, we definitely use reed pens for Kufi, most of Arabic calligraphy, but Kufi is definitely has the squared pen. And you use it, or
I use, yeah, I don't use reeds very much, but when I do use them, it's because I've been asked to write or repair some kind of ritual object that has got a more Sephardi look to it. So Sepharad is Hebrew for Spain and Portugal, basically Iberia. And there are different ways of writing the same alphabet, and they were basically dictated. These different shapes are dictated by the tools and the materials. So you will get in Spain and Portugal and in the Maghreb, and then the Middle East and Yemen, and actually all the way out to India, you will have Jews writing with reeds.
I see.
Traditionally, because of the way that, and the script is very sort of soft. It's more like when people envision what Hebrew looks like, it's that soft sort of serifs, and you know, it's sort of a rounded alphabet. In China, the Chinese Jews use a brush, actually, but I didn't bring one of those. And if you are a European Jew, then you will be trained to use a quill. And this was because when Hebrew scribes ended up moving into Europe, there's a saying in one of the books that you learn when you're learning to be a scribe, and it says, on the one hand, it says, we can only use quills, we never use feathers. And then the next voice says, but we have to use feathers now. And the first one says, why do you use feathers? You're not supposed to. And again, I'm paraphrasing. And then the next voice says again, because they don't make reeds like they used to. And obviously the reeds haven't changed, but in Europe, you don't have native reeds that will stand up to being a pen. Everything is it's too soft and it's too flimsy. And so of course the Christian scribes, right, using feathers, goose, turkey. So we can use any animal ingredients, as long as it's a kosher animal. So if we were to be allowed to eat it, if we were going to eat it, then we can use it to do our scribal practice. So, you know, some are just not practical though, like chicken and duck, not so useful. You can, but it's not very useful. So generally you get goose and turkey quills. Yeah.
It's interesting because that means it is actually more place-based than group-based, because everybody in the Middle East uses reeds across the board.
Oh yeah.
Everybody in Europe uses
Everybody.
quills.
Yeah.
In China, they use brushes,
Brushes,
you know,
yeah.
so it's not even, it's completely what you find on the land.
Yeah, it's the broader, like, book culture basically has influenced where we have traveled. And the other thing also about the script is that because you can, I have never been able to get a really thin, sharp line with any kind of reed. And that's not a criticism at all, but it explains maybe why the Hebrew script is how it is in various ways. You can get, and also obviously because the material is different, it's like your nails, right? It's got a different kind of flexibility to it. I mean, different kinds of reeds will also have a different flexibility to it, but you can get very thin, very fine, very sharp lines, tiny, 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 with a feather much more easily. And so the script looks different. So the script is more square, and it's got like really tiny, thin line serifs rather than the soft sort of flowing ones. And they've got, and the little crowns that we put on the letters also are quite a bit different as well. But other than that, we basically cut them the same, you know, so, and the same as how you cut them, except with Kupi, as you said, it's square, not oblique.
Yes.
Right.
You get more, yes, it's very difficult to do Kufi with an oblique one. You get a lot more freedom of movement with this really. But well, we use the corners a lot to make the small details, because like I said, it's not a cursive style at all. There's a lot of, actually it's constantly trying to imitate the original mosaic. So there are corners that are completely non-calligraphic, lots of little filling in, and for this we need a corner. So a square shape gives you a lot more range. But I have to say, we also have, I found a text where they do mention the quill, but it's not for calligraphy, it's for drawing, doing the fine lines around, and I believe for the diacritics on the letters, because they're very hard to do with a square pen. You need a little instrument like that.
And as a sophomore, you have to learn how to do the whole, like you brought this, which is something that you use to.
Yes. So,
I guess we should hold
so
it up.
this little bit of mess here, this little scribble, is called geed, and it literally is sinew. So it's again from a kosher animal, and it's basically the Achilles tendon.
Right.
So, and there are a couple of families who live in Israel who it's the way they make their living. They know how to comb out, they dry the tendons. I apologize for all the vegetarians and the vegans, but as I like to say, Torah is visceral. And they, I didn't get it like this. It came in a nice roll, you know, but I've messed this up, because this is how I work. So, yeah, if you can see that, it's actually really strong as well.
It's very strong.
And it's basically, they dry the sinew and they comb it out, and then they spin it.
Okay.
Like thread, sort of like thread.
And then it's used to
sew all the pages together.
Okay.
So in a long scroll, you'll have the seams, and then they're folded in a particular way, and then you sew them in a particular way with this. Yeah, so we've got that, and we've got some parchment here as well. So this is the back, it's the hair side, which is why you can see there's a little bit of irregular color. And this is the front, which is very velvety. It's got some pencil marks on it. But it's been scored. You might be able to see that. I'm not sure, because that is also how we have to work. We're not allowed to use any kind of like pigmentation. We can only use like dividers, you know, we can only make sort of like points, or we have to also like score lines, and then the letters all hang from the line because they've got these nice thick roofs, most of them. And it's not even that it's a guideline. It's not only a guideline. It's also that when you are working with an oblique pen, then you can feel with the far point, you can feel where the the line is. You don't just see where it is, you can feel where it is, and it really sits in there. And that's part of how you keep your roofs like very straight, very flat. So it's a cheat, but it's it's all for a good cause.
And you were saying that you use Kufic calligraphy maybe in ways that it wouldn't have been used in the past.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, like, so you mentioned in the introduction, I had a historical aspect to my work and a contemporary aspect. So when I teach and all that, I use really the historical, and I stay very close to the sources. I use the materials. I don't use parchment in class because it's not fair on the students to have to buy parchment for their exercises.
Yeah. So you're using paper?
Yes, using very smooth paper. But in my art practice, I'm not doing anything traditional at all. I completely I'm not going to say abstract art, but semi-abstract. I don't know. There isn't a word for it. Back in the Middle East, they might call it hurufiyya, which means letterism.
Letterism.
Yeah, which I don't necessarily identify with, but it's a convenient way of explaining. It's basically art made with letters or with words, which for obvious reasons makes complete sense in the Middle East, because it's a contemporary use of not necessarily calligraphy, but just writing. So it's an alternative approach to contemporary art. And so that would not be, I would still handmade my materials because I don't use anything store-bought anymore. I don't use anything synthetic. But I use a lot of cut paper. I might dye the paper and then cut it, or other materials. I do artist books, etc. So it's a whole other play field.
Yes. And I think that both of you have talked a little bit about how doing the calligraphy gives you insight into aspects of the history that you wouldn't otherwise have insight into. I don't know if you can give any examples of that, that if you were reading about the history of calligraphy, or if you just walked in a museum and looked at a piece, and said, how is it different?
The first time I was writing a Torah scroll, I was living in an open, sort of open plan apartment flat. And I thought, I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to make some tea. So I boiled the kettle. I went to the bathroom. I came out to make the tea, and I saw the parchment, and I had left it on my drawing table, and it was flat. But after I came out of the bathroom and the kettle had boiled, it was doing this. It had started to come alive again. And I thought, oh no, what have I done? Is this permanent? Will I still be able to write on it? Because I was new. So, when you're a scribe and you're new, you're just a baby scribe. There's still a lot to learn, right?
Yeah.
And you can't be taught everything. You have to learn it on your own, a lot of things. So I learned a lot also from a friend and colleague of mine, Rabbi Linda Motzkin, who's also a Sepharad. She's in New York State, and she had, for her materials, for me it's more the inks, but for her it was the skins. So where this is calf parchment, she started collecting deer hides that hunters had shot to feed their families in the Adirondacks, and they didn't need the hides. So she said, I would really love, I'll buy them from you. And they said, no, take them. And she makes, and I was really lucky to be able to spend a little bit of time with her, defleshing, taking the hair away, but also doing it in a way that it's been done for literally thousands of years, where we have to make a verbal declaration. I'm doing this for the sake of making a Torah scroll, for the sake of the commandment of, etc. You have to have very high consciousness, and you have to have, exactly, we call it kavanah in Hebrew, to have like an intention that but you have to say it. You can't even just think it. You have to be right there in the moment. So doing something like that really gets to grips with, the inside and the outside of an animal's skin that it used to protect itself when it was alive. And so you have to really have humility there as well, because, it was a living sentient being. So you have to honor all of that. It's not just about honoring God or your community or anything like that. You really need to be aware of where everything comes from.
So it's sort of integrating, all of nature.
Yes, and obviously the whole thing is biodegradable because it's
Yes, of
skin and
course.
feather, or it's reed, and the ink is also made from gallnuts and, you know, that sort of thing. And it all can just go back to the earth.
So
Like
we're
it never
talking about
existed.
sort of circularity here. It's kind of
Yes.
you're working in that way
Mm,
before people have even been talking about, you know, this is a
Right.
big buzzword at the moment. It's
It
sort of
is.
circular economy and everything like that. But this is the way that traditionally these things have been done.
Right, because that's the way, well, the whole earth works that way, doesn't it? The whole
Yes.
earth is constantly like recycling and making new things out of stuff, and then those things go away and are used to make new things. And we always lived like that as a species. And it's only been very slowly in very recent history that we've been throwing everything away or poisoning everything. So, you know, that's not the case with what we do,
Yes.
thankfully.
Yeah. And no waste. The skins aren't wasted or just thrown away. I mean, I suppose they, you know, biodegrade anyway, but still.
They would. I mean, this is an offcut, which is why it's a bit of an odd shape, but I use this to do repairs. You know, so if I need to patch something, or, you know, or if I need to test my quill on something, because that's something else you have to do once you cut it. You can't just go and do your work because you have to have tested it first. I mean, you really should do that as a calligrapher anyway, but
Yeah.
if you're doing a religious function, then you need to do that to honor the work that you're doing. You have to make sure that you've cut a good nib on that quill. So yeah, so it's very useful for those sorts of things as well. And then you can burn it when you're done, or you can bury it, or, you know, if it doesn't end up being a repair, like, so. Yeah.
And Joumana, I don't know if you have any insights that you've gained through the practice that you don't think you could have gained in other ways.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, there are so many things, so that's why I'm slightly like, where
It's a big
but
question.
I tell you what came to mind, which is a slightly different kind of story from just looking at sources. There's a style I taught recently, which I call the Karmatian Kufi, just for convenience sake, because the main source of it's only known from one copy of the Quran, which has come to us we only have crumbs from it. We only have a few pages out of thousands. It's only known from this, and there is one manuscript in the British Library that uses the same script. And it's not the Quran, it's a commentary, but it has the verses written in that, and then the commentary is in Persian. So looking very carefully at all the pages of the Karmatian Quran that I would gather, I can see there are different scribes. I can see there's one scribe who is really struggling with this newfangled thing, and he's really has habits from the old kind of Kufi. There is one who's like, I call him the Orthodox New Style guy, because yeah, this one has quite what I would associate with the high style of this. There's one, I think this must be a woman, because I'm sure it was not a woman, but I like to think of him as feminine.
More feminine.
Maybe, yeah, because the lines are really kind of sensuous, and his ink is clearly thicker, and it leaves these really nice, beautiful curves. So you can see the individuality of each scribe, but if you just look at the pages as a whole, they are very nicely consistent. They all have the same kind of decoration. The letters, they don't move too much from each other, even though some letters are a bit different, but you wouldn't notice it unless you really look. Now, the non-Quranic manuscript in the British Library has no decoration. Clearly, there was no budget. It's a commentary. And, you know, it's very clear that the scribe did not have the same constraints because it was not a commissioned Quran.
Right.
And, you know, I call him Mahmoud because among friends, you know, like nearly Mahmoud is having a blast. Okay, because there are decorative letters and every one is different.
Right.
It's like every lam alif is doing something. You know?
He's trying to
He's doing everything. He is really enjoying himself. I mean, really, you can look at it like, whoa, I'm inventing things, you know, filling the page. He has little, I don't know, they look like little spiders hanging from the cap. They're going all over the place. And it's amazing because I learned so much from looking at this manuscript, which is clearly not constrained by the needs of, you're doing a Quran, you all have to work in a style that is like, you know, it has to look really consistent. So there was this awareness that in this case, we all work together. We do something beautiful. These are our boundaries. And this one, he's still doing something beautiful. It was like, hey, it's just me. And there's no decoration, so it's up to me. So, and I have collected, I have dozens, like just take the letter calf. I have almost 80 different calves in that one volume alone. So, it's a delight. And you can really see, because also he's working much faster. It's not as polished. I can see the tracing of the letters because it's not seamless. So I can see exactly how he's drawing them. So I learn a lot just from poring over them.
And then how does that enter into your own practice? What happens? How does that conversation that you're having with this person from the past, Mahmoud, how does that enter?
Mahmoud is now famous for like, I tell everybody about him. Well, first, because it allows me to really deconstruct the letters and find, it's quite a difficult style. So it allows me to find the way to do them in the orthodox way.
I see.
And from there, I can, because once you do it in the orthodox way, then your hand can kind of be allowed to take its own signature for that way. But also it shows me, it's just very inspiring to see where you can go if you just let go. But also I've learned how the evolution of some letters through him. And, I can't even predict how it's going to,
Yes.
it all goes into the pot and there's the alchemy happens and it will happen. I'm not even,
so you're not thinking about it. It's
No,
something that you're
I
just
think
absorbing again, embodying.
it's the kind of thing, if you think about it too much, you kill it.
Yeah.
Just let it happen. It all happens in the unconscious, right? And the unconscious is much bigger and much smarter than you. So just trust, basically.
It's funny because I was writing about a Kufic, actually, Kufic script, and how there's, when you first look at it, it has a look, but then you sort of get drawn into the rhythms of it. There's rhythms, there's spaces that are the letters and the spaces in between. And I don't know, I just had this experience where I'm kind of being drawn into that rhythm. And I wonder about, is that finding, because it seems that the spaces in between are almost as important as the letters themselves.
100%. Yeah.
And is that finding that?
It's very interesting you say that, because the spacing in Kufi is famously very big.
Yes.
And all my students really struggle with that. They all want to do.
They want to put it together.
They want to put it together. And it's like, but it's all about the emptiness. It's all about being empty. It's all about breathing. It's all about what's happening in between. It's not about the doing, it's about the non-doing. And it's so interesting that, and so symbolic how everybody struggles with that, because it's not part of our society anymore. Silent, just being silent. And I think somewhere it does all fit together.
I mean, it feels like the training that you were given from your two masters as you talk, but some of it was just about keeping you literally keeping you silent, as you're saying, when he's saying, whatever he said, be quiet, to put it politely. But that training as a traditional artist, we could say, is kind of helps you to find the spaces between the letters, in a sense, because it's that silence. I don't know.
Yeah.
One thing I realized years after, after I was no longer working with my teacher, I mean, I still do when I come over, but was I realized that the biggest gift he gave me was not to teach me, the non-teaching, because it allowed me to find my way to certain things without him giving me a shortcut to them. Because it has so much value, just allowing the student to find their way somewhere has so much more value than telling them this is how you do it, this is the answer. And I find that is completely lacking from Western style of teaching. You just want to give them all the material.
You need to give them the foundation.
Exactly. You need to put them on the path.
But then the student needs to do their own springboard, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for me, that's a whole different type of knowledge that we're working with there than the kind of knowledge that most of us get in our education, in Western education, if we wanted to call it.
Which has its place.
Absolutely.
But in the arts, it should not be applied to the arts.
Exactly. This is one of the things that I say to my students, where I talk about, I give them a lot of information about different kinds of art supplies. Not if they're learning Hebrew calligraphy, not how to be a scribe. And I say, well, there's pros and cons to this, and this, and different kinds of nibs and different kinds of pen holders, and But really what you need to do is look at your budget, and you need to try them, and you need to see how they feel, and you need to see what works for you. And then it's a process of them learning, you know, how much ink will this nib take, right? How big a letter? Bronze nibs, not bronze, something else, you know. Yeah, sometimes it's better to use acrylic inks, sometimes really not. You can't use acrylic inks with reeds. That's a very bad idea. So let's see.
Carving it out of.
Yeah, exactly. So it's and I'm when I'm explaining this, I'm a little bit apologetic, because really I should just be saying, do this and this and this, and you're good. But until they are picking it up and they are using the paper and they are using the materials and they feel it, they're going to have their own preferences. I can't tell them what those are. They have to explore them for themselves, and they have to develop them themselves. So I can give them lots of information and I can show them things. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that have to put the work in. They have to develop their own relationship. So,
And how long did you both have to take before you felt almost like that you'd embodied enough of these letters to be able to let things flow a little bit more? Or how long did it take? And do lots of people drop along the way? Are people not able to put in that time for that to happen?
To be honest, I think it's ongoing. It's
ongoing.
like every time I look back, I'm like, oh, you know, maybe after 5 years, I said, yeah, maybe, yeah, okay. And then after 10 years, I'm like, yeah, maybe now. And now after 15 years, I'm like, yeah, maybe now. You know, it's like, it's completely non-ending. But the thing is, you have to jump in before, you know, if you wait till you're ready, you're never going to do anything. It's better to jump in and make mistakes than to wait until you're, because that's never going to happen. I always say, this is going to take my entire life. You know, I hope I can do enough of it before I die, because it's just enormous. And for people, you know, for students, I'm really happy at the number of students I have actually who are really serious about this and who continue exploring on their own. And I tell them, you look at historic sources and you continue doing your thing. But there are also, the greater majority of people, they want something quick. They want to learn it in a weekend and be done. And, you know, and the people who kill me, because we both have an online course on a certain platform. And recently I've had people come and it's like, you know, I don't have a pen, so I reproduce the feel of it on Procreate, and this is my homework. And I'm like, no, come back to me when you have found a pen and ink. You know, don't even talk to me. The only requirement of this course is that you use a pen and ink. And good paper that is not gridded. So you know, do that. I am not, you know, I'm not going to indulge that kind of thing.
No, not going to give feedback on that.
No, I'm not giving feedback on that. You know, it's just people expect to be fed something very quickly and to acquire it very quickly, and it's not. It is literally a life thing. If you want to do it seriously, it's going to take the rest of your life.
It is. And it's not a popular thing to say anymore. It sounds very old-fashioned. And now a lot of people, like you say, they want to be an expert in a weekend, or they think, oh, it's good enough because I did it. But then that's when your ego is coming into play. And it's not about the letters anymore. It's not about the words. It's not about the practice or the work any longer. So it's with any relationship, right? You have to put in, and what you don't put in is what you are not going to get out of it, and you will not even see it. You will not even be able to see it. So I mean, with me, I was going back and forth between Victoria and then later Vancouver in British Columbia to Jerusalem for 7 years.
That's motivation.
That's motivation. Yes, I really wanted to do this. And I really found like the very best teachers. And we're still friends. I still, you know, me too. When I go, then I always see them, and you know, and we're in touch in the meantime, obviously, because sometimes I have questions, or sometimes I want to show them something, or you know, but it's like the joy of when you are having a bad quill day and you keep cutting the quill And it's not giving you what you need it to, but that's your fault. You don't blame the feather, you know, what's going on with you. You have to be like very conscious of this. And then when you do cut a good quill, it is so exciting. You know, it's such joy. Oh, I've made the best tool. This is, I look forward now to the letters I'm going to be able to make because I've made a good tool. You know, I've got good materials, and then you need the quiet, as you say. And you need to have that interior quiet, not just the exterior quiet, for you to really make the letters.
So is there anything that one can do to encourage it, or it's either there or it's not? And if it's not, maybe it's not the best day to practice? Or are there, you know, ways, are there things that you do before you enter the studio to
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, you can, of course, if it's not there, and if you, for instance, classic, you sit down and you do ellipse.
Yeah,
Just one after the other.
That's a good one.
Until, you know, that's, and always, or even just ruling the paper. Like if I'm teaching and my students have just arrived and, you know, they were late because of the tube, I just have them sit down and rule a few pages. And I used to do this as a ritual, even when I was in high school. It was always before starting on an important homework. Just do something very pedestrian, but that will actually work as a buffer zone so that I can land, you know. Yeah.
We do that, but it's not Aleph because even though it's the same name, those two letters look very different from each other now. They didn't used to. They came from the same other earlier alphabets, both Arabic and Hebrew, and actually Greek, Cyrillic, Latin. They've all actually come from the first alphabet. But sort of the equivalent, similar shape would be something like Vav, which in Arabic, and it's the same kind of thing where it's just like you just do this repetitive. But it's not repetitive in a machine-like way. You still need to be present with the letter, and you're still watching what you're doing, and you're also getting feedback from how everything feels, and you're seeing how it looks, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it. And some people use Vav, or they'll use Yud, which is the very little tiny letter. That is just a good thing to do with it, really any kind of calligraphy practice for sure. If you are going to, say, be writing a Torah scroll or a ritual object, then just like in most religions, you get up in the morning, you bathe, well, most people do that anyway, regardless of how they feel about religion, and you pray, and you have to have gotten your own physical needs sort of sorted out first, and you also have to pay attention to God before you approach the work. And if you have any kind of like illness, then you're really not supposed to do it because you can't sneeze on the parchment. I don't recommend that. And you can't work, let's say it's so noisy because maybe there's building works going on next door or something, where you can't focus, or maybe you've got some kind of digestive upset, you know, and you just can't do that. So you need to find something else to do with your time that day. And there are very good practical reasons why it's not permitted. When it says in the rule book, as it were, oh, you're not allowed to do this, it just sounds a bit, you know, pat. But I mean, if you really think about the practicalities of it, it's saving you actually from making a terrible mistake.
Yeah, like that you have then to have hours cleaning it out. It's better not to work that.
It's better not to. Yeah.
We had one student who was looking at she's from Nepal, and she was looking at a tradition of painting there. And when she looked at, and this existed in a very diminished form, I would say, now. And so she had to put a lot of things back together. And she found that there were relationships between patron, painter, and priest, that it was like a triangular relationship that no longer existed anymore. And I don't know if those kind of relationships, like, are there patrons today? Are there people that will support your work today? And what about that spiritual side of things? How does that work in your practice today, if it does?
Okay. Take this one first then. Okay. Well, I mean, as part of my Judaica work, which is the mostly non-ritual stuff, there's something that's called a ketubah, which is a Jewish wedding contract. And it's traditionally written in Aramaic, because it used to be the lingua franca.
Yes.
But obviously you can write it in any language. And there's a lot of opinions about that anyway. So that's something that I will illustrate. I'll meet with the couple. I'll use there are various different kinds of scripts that I write, so we can discuss about that and how the decorative border is going to be and how it's going to reflect them and their lives and things like that. And whether it's in Aramaic or Hebrew or English or Portuguese or, you know, because I've actually did one in Arabic once, which was it was a bit touch and go because I don't read Arabic.
All right.
I tried. I warned them. I was like, I need a really big copy so that I can distinguish between the different heights of the letters and things like that. You know, because I don't want to make a mistake. So I do things like that. And you know, if it's on parchment and there's lots of gold leaf, because I do illumination, then, you know, then I would call them patrons in a way. I mean, there's certainly other artists who are, you know, other Hebrew calligraphy artists who are like much better known than I am and much more skilled than I am, who do incredible work, who are always writing custom made books. One of my teachers included, actually, he recently put up some images on his socials of the calligraphy did of a book that was completely illustrated, and also of a Megillat Esther, a scroll of the Book of Esther. And they measured it for Guinness because it was the longest scroll of Esther ever in history, apparently. And they had to roll it out sort of diagonally in a gym. It was that long. It's not normally that long. I don't know if you're familiar, even in Hebrew, the Book of Esther is not that long. Yes, exactly. So, so there are people that commission things like that. Many years ago, there's a very famous Haggadah. The Haggadah it's a word that means like a storytelling. It's the book that we use during Passover, during the Seder at Passover, the meal that we have. And there's a very famous Israeli artist called David Moss, and there was this book called the Moss Haggadah, and it took him 10 years.
Wow.
And it's all he worked on for 10 years. And you can buy like facsimiles of it. Even those aren't affordable for most people. And it's there are people, and obviously I get approached by synagogues and also people wanting to dedicate maybe a Torah scroll to a particular person they've lost or to a cause or something like that. So then I will work with them as far as writing something like that. And those are very large projects. Those take a year and a half, maybe longer, it depends. So it's just about making time in your schedule, blocking off the time. I mean, I'm starting to write a new Esther scroll now for this Purim. That's the holiday where we read it.
That's not until almost a year from now. Like,
no, Purim is
I'm thinking
this year. It's on
October,
March
but
7th. Oh, you're
I'm way
thinking of
wrong.
the high holidays. You're thinking of like Rosh Hashanah and
Okay.
Yom Kippur and Sukkot. And, yeah, no, Purim this year, because it's Hebrew calendar is different than the English calendar. It's on March 7th, I think, this year. So I need to
Get going.
get going on it and send it to them. Yes, I do. What do you think I'm going to do after this? That's right. Time is it? No, I'm just joking.
Too difficult a question.
It's kind of, I don't know what to say. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, never mind.
I'm going to ask another difficult question. And
Excellent.
this is because you've been talking a lot about, you know, the ways you were taught, what the kinds of approach, the sort of approach that you take to your work and to the objects that you're working with, to your methods, to your materials, how it's all about slowing down, how it's not the type of knowledge that can just be passed along in words. There's it needs to be embodied. So how do you take that and try and get that sense across to those students who are coming here to the school for a week-long course? How do you get that atmosphere or sense across?
I like to make an analogy with the Karate Kid.
Okay.
Wax on, wax off, you know? Am I right?
I'm just thinking of all the headaches that come along with designing such a course.
Yes, I'm sure it must be a
Well, you
challenge.
kind of have to be very firm in that yourself, not because there's always a temptation to just give more material
Yes.
or a kind of, so it's always, you have to be very firm, like they're not going to like me for this, but I'm going to stick to my guns. And generally I find people are very understanding, and I very rarely have somebody who I have to tell off. Actually, I can't, other than that online course, I really can't remember having, well, maybe once. But
I mean, do you try and create something for the
well, I will tell you what, for instance, I always say, please, you put your phones on flight mode and you put them away.
Yes.
I don't want your mind to be drawn to a notification. We need to be immersed in this. We need to have no interruption. So, you're welcome to, if you need to make a phone call, you're welcome to leave the room and do that. But I want you to forget you have anything outside this room while you're working. And when they do that, the atmosphere takes care of itself. And by the end of it, people have noticed how much, I mean, in a sense, in a certain way, I am holding the space in a certain way. So if I'm clear in myself, I can hold the space without having to talk about it. But there are some practical things like the phones and the distractions to be put out of the way. But it's kind of, it's hard to explain because you kind of just do it. You just, in the moment, you just know what to do. Or even when the way I prepare the class.
Yes.
For instance, in a way, I always put chairs in the back so that people can put their stuff on the chairs and leave the table as uncluttered as possible. Small things like that you do in the moment and you don't necessarily think about, but it just feels right.
You can't just have your jacket here and your bag here, and
exactly.
and then it's it has to just be you and the paper and the pen.
Circulation has to be, there's always all these little things, and they're a bit like, I don't know, like being a good, it's like when you receive people and you prepare the house in a certain way so that the guests feel at ease and there's space for them, and you have removed yourself from the space so that they can take, there's all these little things. And I think being from the Middle East, I do this very instinctively.
Yes.
Because we have that in the culture a lot. And it's kind of, it's things like that. And it's actually, it's interesting that you asked this because I never thought about that.
Well,
but I know that
naturally.
Kind of, but it's very much about holding the space in a certain way and being very firm and not, you want to be kind, but you don't have to be nice.
I like that. Yeah.
You have to, you're holding the tradition. It's not about you. It's not about the students are not going to like me for this. It's about, well, what is the tradition going to think of me? That's the priority.
It's true. Yeah. If you are holding that and you are entrusted with that tradition, then you have an obligation that if you're going to pass it on, then it has to reflect the tradition and not
exactly. And it includes withholding information.
Yes.
Not because you're not worthy to have it, but because if I give it to you, I'm going to spoil your progress because this is something you need to find on your own.
Yes.
Or,
so you have to know when to pass the information on and when not to. And very interesting. Yeah.
So
I think I suppose I'll just ask one last question, which is what do you think the future of your traditions are?
I left my crystal ball in my other.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know.
In other words, is it, do you feel that it's the same as it ever was? It's the same as it ever was. It's going to go on.
Well, no, I mean, I literally have to bring it back from the dead. So for me,
so it's a question of bringing it back to the dead. But you've been able to bring it back from the dead.
Well, yes, I have. But is it going to continue after me? I don't know.
Yes.
But
in a sense, you're saying it doesn't really matter because it can be brought back from the dead.
It can be, absolutely. If the people who really want it for the right reasons can bring it back anytime, at least for their practice.
Yes. Okay. I think that's a great answer.
Well, let's see, the future of Sofrut. Well, I mean, there aren't actually a shortage of male scribes who know how to write Torah scrolls and
So
make
it's
various other things.
healthy.
That's not a
Healthy.
problem. Yeah, there's always new people learning. But I think we definitely need to mentor more women who are interested so that it will become just a lot more commonplace and a lot less unique, a lot less special. That it'll just be a scribe and it won't matter.
What kind?
It won't matter what kind.
Yeah, which is a good thing, it seems.
Well, I've been working on it, but it's gonna take more than just me.
It's very exciting what you've done, Avielah. It's very exciting.
Well, it's exciting what a lot of the other women scribes, have also been doing over the last years,
Exactly.
as,
It's like something's changing. There's a sort of good something happening.
hopefully, yeah.
Well, we've got already lots of questions. Let's see. Okay. Here's one for both of you. How did the fact that where did it go now? How did the fact that both scribal traditions are heavily male dominated and in the Jewish case still is a closed club, which actually it's not because you've managed to.
It's still pretty close.
Pretty close.
It's not
but-
just me also, it's
Okay.
also the other women, yeah.
Yes. How did this affect your journey with the learning and the practice?
Well, my journey has been very solitary for obvious reasons. I mean, with my teacher, there was no problem at all. We had a very deep connection, and that didn't come into it. And my journey has been very, very solitary. So I didn't have any issues, but you would not believe how much mansplaining I have to put up with. You really would not imagine. So yeah. I think I've enough said, really.
Let's see, with me, I suppose it's education. If you can show, there's a lot of people who have a lot of erroneous beliefs about what the rules are, about who can do what for other people, as far as like sort of the hierarchy of obligation and commandedness and that sort of thing. I think education is important because once people understand that even in pre-feminist, very traditional rulings and in law in Judaism, and that doesn't mean to say that the post-feminist modern laws that are, they're just as valid, but if you can even show beforehand all of this, that there's room for women to practice this tradition, then they can choose whether or not to accept that, because obviously everyone has to make their own decisions about their religious practice and what their ideas of things are and stuff like that. And then you have to respect that. But I think for a lot of people, they don't realize that there is room. Yeah, there's a lot of opinions and there's room. And I mean, it depends on the article. If it's something like the Scroll of Esther, then the majority of opinions say, oh yes, women can do it, not a problem. And then it just depends on which other piece you're talking about. There's different rules, but I think education is really important. And then to have a conversation about it. Is it important for us to still be honoring these things? Because we've always had a very long tradition of debate and discussing rules and law and things like that in Judaism. So, I mean, that needs to continue.
Yeah,
It needs to be organic.
Yes, and it is, isn't it?
It is. Well, I mean, halakha does mean sort of like the way or the going or you're moving forward.
Conversation.
Hopefully. Yeah. The conversation is holy.
Joumana, I think this one's for you. When and where did Islami, Arabesque, Rumi, in other words, sort of forms based on vegetal growth, where did these things originate? Is there such a thing as Kufic Islami or Arabesque?
Okay, this is not my area. We call it Zakhrafa. I think Islami is a very
it's a
new
very
term. So it's not, I'm not specialized in this at all. So I'm just going to give you a very rough answer, which is, I think it comes more from Eastern lands because it's really associated with Persian art, and the only time you really see it with Kufi is in Eastern styles. but I don't know exactly. I will tell you why, because Kufi was mostly associated with the Abbasid era. Pretty much it's a script of the Abbasid era. And this was a very sober era. So the Qurans of that time are really austere. I mean, they're very beautiful in their simplicity, but there's not much decoration. So it's possible that at that time, Zakhrafa was used in other places, but it was not really used in the Quran. So as I have not studied the history of Zakhrafa, I cannot tell you exactly when and where it came about, but you don't see it in those early Qurans.
There's the shamsas, though. You have the shamsas begin to come in.
Well, they're verse markers, but they are freehand. There's no science behind them. There's no kind of, like literally, I have a collection of verse markers from one manuscript, and every one is different. You know, the guy was having a blast, like, hey, we have all this beautiful austere calligraphy. The verse markers is a place where I can just do whatever I like. You know,
so maybe what has to happen in the beginning till we figure out what we want.
No, it's beautiful. It's fantastic, but it was clearly there wasn't a school of the forms at that time. You know, because there were so. It would be interesting to see a study specifically of that, but my study has been extremely focused on just the letter form.
Okay, Avielah, what are some of the rules a Hebrew scribe has to follow in working with a manuscript?
Well, you have to verbally sanctify God's name. God has 7 different names that appear in the Torah, for example, and you have to stop. You have to be aware of what you are. I mean, you have to say every letter and say every word anyway, and some scribes actually have a tradition of singing it. I don't. I follow what my teachers have taught me. They don't sing, so I don't sing. But you have to stop, and some scribes will specifically dip their quill again before they write. Others will say, no, you can't do that, because then you'll mess up the letters. So yeah, there's a big ritual around every single name, and sometimes you have 2 in a row, sometimes you have 3 in a row. So that's very important. And if you ever make a mistake with any of God's names, then you better hope that it's something that you can add ink to fix, because you absolutely cannot subtract from any of God's names, and you cannot, as a general rule, with any word, you are not, or any letter, you're not allowed to form any of the shapes by carving away or by scratching away. If 2 letters accidentally touch, then yes, you can go, and then you're good, because they're not allowed to touch. That's another rule. But yeah, you absolutely have to form them by writing, by adding.
Getting it, so you just have to stop and get a new parchment and start over.
Well, you can actually like you can cut windows, you can cut out the mistake that you're not allowed to change, and then you actually attach from behind, and then you can rewrite it. So you can do that, but it is ugly. But it does save the entire sheet of parchment, which is one hide.
That's your scroll that goes from one corner of the gym to the other.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Okay, Joumana, this is for you. You've spoken about translating original texts. What texts are these, and how does your work with the translations feed into your own practice?
So far I've completed 2, Zinat al-Kataba by Al-Razi, which dates from the 10th century, and Tuhaf al-Khawas by Al-Qalalwsi, which is 13th century in Andalusia. And now I'm working on Amdat al-Kuttab, which is the famous one that was very badly translated, which is from Tunis around the 12th century. There are more, but these are the 3 that I have so far. And very simply, it's because I discover recipes for inks. And then I try them. I try every one of them when I'm translating. That's how I know my translation is accurate. And then I can use these materials. I mean, some of them I wouldn't really use because they're corrosive or whatnot, but this is how I discover new materials, new plants, and new ways of extracting the color. So it really fits into my work materially. And then the materials also inspire bodies of work, which would be a long answer, but I am giving a talk about this in a couple of days, so I will be writing about this. But the materials themselves inspire ways of working and themes of working.
That's interesting.
So it does feed in all sorts of ways. Everything comes together, and everything ends up coming back out in a certain way.
So most of the texts are about materials, basically.
They are ink maker treatises,
Yeah.
how to make inks,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
black inks, colored inks, and then there's how to clean the inks out of your clothes. And, no, seriously,
Useful.
and then actually I want to mention this because this is a recipe I have found in all the texts. And in case you think these people took themselves very seriously, the recipe goes: if you want to stop a scribe from being able to write, you put tamarind juice in his inkwell. And then you just watch him struggle. This is a 10th century recipe that has been handed down to
This
Egypt.
is for teachers.
So you can imagine the new guy in the workshop who's been
Yeah.
given a pen for the first day. You have been cleaning the workshop for 2 years. Today you get to write, and then he lives and is not writing. The whole workshop must be going. So yeah, I love that.
That's very funny. Avielah, this is for you.
Mhm.
Have you worked with Paleo Hebrew script? And is there a movement to revive Paleo Hebrew script in a way analogous to the Kufic script for Arabic? And if not, why not?
I have worked with Paleo Hebrew script. I've done some artwork that is on my Instagram. I also have been experimenting with writing it on papyrus because we did find, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there are samples of papyrus, and some of them are written in what we know now as the square Hebrew letters, but there's also the Paleo Hebrew, which is really what Hebrew was before the exile into Persia, basically, where we picked up Aramaic and then that alphabet, Syrian. It's we call it Kitab Ashuri, so that means like Syrian script. Yeah. So I have the Paleo Hebrew expert in my family is in fact my husband, who's doing his
Perfect.
PhD at Cambridge. So he would be better placed to answer that question. He's not here, but he's you can find his work at sofer.co.uk.
Sofer.co.uk.
Yes.
See, also
Mordechai
Sofer?
Pinchas. He is. That's how we met.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how we met. So we're the only married scribes in the world. And so I've been immersed in paleography because of that, more than I would have originally. And the thing that's interesting too is sort of like the paleography of the tagine, the crowns that we put on the letters. And earlier when you were saying about like the verse. The verse markers. You know, some people go completely mental with these little crowns, and especially if it's like a top line, they'll just do like dandelions and fireworks and pomegranates, and it's there's some space, and I can, you know, but it's usually specific letters. I mean, we also have other books in our tradition that say which ones get which tagine, and there's different traditions, and which letters are made larger than the rest proportionately or smaller, etc. That's a whole other conversation. So yeah, there's not a movement to revive it per se, but I'm into it. So contact me. Watch the space. I'm there.
Okay, this is for both of you. Why would parchment or paper, or we could add papyrus, be chosen for different contexts?
So in the case of Kufi, it was very much due to before paper came about, so before they even knew about paper, parchment was the only suitable support, because you know it's smooth, you can have a page, papyrus is quite brittle after a while, and the ink, which is tannin ink, really went with parchment because it more, it bites into it and you can't erase it off it easily. You can
tannin in
the tannin ink, from the
okay.
walnuts. So the two went together. But it's very expensive, it's one page, one sheep.
Yes.
Basically. So in that sense, so it's not a question of context so much, it's a case of the material culture. And then when paper came about, which came, quite early, and then when the quality of the paper became good enough to be used for sacred writing, it wasn't falling apart, then they very quickly shifted to paper, and then they had to shift the ink as well because the carbon ink is much more suitable for it. So it's not really a question of, if you're doing a sacred book, then the support has to be durable, clean, whatever, but it doesn't matter exactly what it is unless, I don't know, maybe in your case, it's a bit more codified.
It is a bit more codified, yeah.
A euphemism.
Oh, yes. Well, well, I mean, yes. So I mean, everything was on papyrus originally, just like, you know, with everyone's tradition in the Middle East, it was just papyrus was the thing.
Yeah.
And then the carbon ink that was appropriate to that. And then there's an argument in the Talmud about, you know, you have to use this kind of ink or that kind of ink, either basically with the tannin and the
Yes.
iron or copper sulfite, or just the carbon ink for different rituals or different situations. But yeah, I mean, papyrus is handy in that you don't have to score it necessarily because it's got that vegetable, yeah, exactly, but it is very textured.
Yeah.
So, and as you say, it's brittle. I mean, it's very flexible when it's new and when it's still a bit damp. But you know, it is much easier and faster to get eaten by bugs over time as well.
Yes.
Even though bugs love this, they don't love eating the ink so much. But yeah, it's yeah, there's certain combinations that work well together and others that don't. And it's this case for different kinds of inks and papers as well, actually.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting because working with painters a lot, I think when they're talking about how the quality of paper is now declining, that they can't even get the papers that they used to be able to get. You know, the paper mills are no longer producing papers that they used to be able to get. But like everything, I suppose, you know, technique is never a kind of barrier to these things coming back again. These techniques can be free as soon as people are interested in doing that. So hopefully.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been really lovely. Thank you both for being so
Thank you.
willing to put up with all these really
That's
questions.
great.
And
It's fun.
I really enjoyed it.
We did not deliberately dress to match.
You know, they're so
This just shows what good friends we are, friends and neighbors who are scribes.
And you both have websites or something where we could find out more about your work as well.
Yes, mine is majnouna.com, majnouna.com.
Mine is soferet.com. And my Instagram is @soferet_Avielah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.